Okay, in this video we're going to learn how to set arguments in standard form. This is an important technique if you want to discover the actual structure of the argument, what it really says, outside of the distractions, and if we want to evaluate it. To set an argument in standard form, you first list all premises, then you number them, and then you draw a line after the last premise, and then you write the conclusion below it, just to signal that what follows is a conclusion. When it comes to listing premises, there are a few things that we have to keep in mind. First, we have to remove the inessential sentences, right? So there are some sentences in the exposition of arguments that don't add anything, that just add clutter, and so we can leave them out. Also, remember that there were some phrases that indicated the presence of conclusions or of premises. Well, those can also be left out. Also, you might need to paraphrase, that is, express the same thought but in other words, perhaps to make it shorter or to make it more understandable. Also, sometimes authors, when they present an argument, they leave out some premises that are important but that they think that their audience will be able to fill in, right? Well, sometimes in order to evaluate the arguments, you have to add some tacit or implicit premises. So once you have listed all premises, then what you're left is, well, the next step, which is the conclusion, and then you have basically the skeleton of the argument. We not only list the premises, but we usually also number them, though this is not always necessary, though it's good practice. It's going to be necessary when we need to keep track of the premises, when we have to quote them, or when there are sub-arguments, that is, argument over arguments. But let's just make it a habit of numbering premises. Once we're done listing the premises, then, as we said, we draw a line underneath the last premise, and then we write the conclusion. Often, we precede the conclusion with this symbol, this 3 dots, right, which is an abbreviation of therefore. Why is this helpful? Well, as we also mentioned earlier, sometimes it is very useful to have an explicit and concise representation of the structure of the argument, so as to better assess the argument and the conclusion that it leads to. So here we have an example of an argument written in ordinary form, which we're going to set in standard form. Okay, so now you can scan the text and look for one of the argument markers, which is, if you remember, expressions that indicate that we're in the presence of a premise or a conclusion. So let's see if we can find one. If we look at the third line, we find an occurrence of because, which usually precedes premises. Thus, the sentence that immediately follows because will be a premise. And here the premise is underlined, and it says, medication does not address psychological and lifestyle issues. As a next step, let's draw 2 columns. Let us also write the argument, as it was originally presented, in the left column. In the right column, we'll represent the same argument, but in standard form. So we'll introduce one by one each one of the premises as we identify them, or the conclusion, if we find it first, because arguments are not always presented neatly, with the conclusion following the premise, and the present argument is an example in which that order is not respected. So the first element we identified was a premise, and we assigned it the number 1. And as I said, in the end, it doesn't matter in which order you present the premises, so the numeration is just for convenience. Also, notice that I eliminated the occurrence of that, which goes immediately before because, since it's not doing any work for us. Okay, so let's go back to the argument. As we keep on reading, we can see that everything that follows because is part of the premises. In particular, we have 2 premises separated by a period, and here we're marking them explicitly. So we enter the premises into the standard form column. Okay, premise 2 is medical problems are not purely biochemical. Now consider premise 3. It begins with the pronoun they. Now in this case, it is clear that they refers to medical problems, given the relation between this sentence and the previous one. However, it isn't always that clear what terms like he, she, it, their, or then refer to in a given context. So it's better if we make a habit of replacing their occurrences with the corresponding complete phrases, like so. And now we have medical problems involve issues of attitude and way of life. Now it doesn't matter if it sounds repetitive, because what we are aiming for here is clarity. So here we have our 3 premises enumerated. So first, medication does not address psychological and lifestyle issues. 2, medical problems are not purely biochemical. And 3, medical problems involve issues of attitude and way of life. Going back to our argument, the only sentence left out of this moment is the first one. That is the only one that doesn't follow because. And that's the conclusion. Everything else is being offered as support for this conclusion. So the conclusion is, it is a mistake to think that medical problems can be treated solely by medication. So we write it in our right column, and then we put a line above it, so to indicate that it is the conclusion. So here's the argument in standard form by itself. Let me note that in this case, the order of the premises doesn't really matter. However, as we'll see, it does matter in the case where an argument contains sub-arguments within itself, and in general, in any case in which it is necessary to keep track of the premises. For instance, if you have to cite the premises from which you derived a given conclusion. Note also that the statements have been simplified here, and that the subject of each statement has been specified explicitly. For instance, by replacing the pronoun they in premise 3 with the noun phrase medical problems. Okay, let's see another example. This passage was taken from the story Silver Blaze, from the memoirs of Sherlock Holmes. And here Holmes is dazzling Watson with his reasoning chops. It says, a dog was kept in the stables, and yet, though someone had been in and fetched out a horse, the dog had not barked. Obviously, the visitor was someone whom the dog knew well. It seems clear that, although there are no standard explicit argument markers anywhere, the term obviously is introduced in the conclusion of the reasoning. Also, notice that this word can be left out of the representation of the conclusion in the standard form. Now, since we only have one conclusion, we know that the rest of the passage, or at least the relevant parts, must be occupied by the premises. So let's go to the top to identify them. The very first statement is a strong candidate to be a premise. A dog was kept in the stables. The term and just links the premise with the following sentence, and yet only serves to suggest that the statement that follows is somehow unexpected, given the previous one. But, however, they are not part of the content of any premise, so we can leave them out. The next statement is underlined here. Notice that it begins with though. But here, what it does is that it indicates that the statement is somehow composed of 2 contrasting parts, one being someone had been in and fetched out a horse, and the second being the dog had not barked. There are 2 things to note here. First, that the word though can be left out of the standard form. Second, we can take each part of the complex statement as if it were a separate premise. We don't necessarily have to do this, but I think it makes clearer what's going on. So, we are ready to set the argument in standard form. Here it is. This next example illustrates another aspect that must be taken into account. Often, when speaking or writing, we sometimes left some words or phrases out, with the expectation that the audience is going to be able to fill the gaps. For instance, suppose that this sentence is said by a mother to her child, who is crying because he had a small cut in one of his fingers. Now, literally, what the sentence means is that the child is immortal. But that's obviously not what the mother meant. What she meant is that the child was not going to die from that particular cut. However, to save breath, she left that last part out, knowing that the kid was perfectly capable of figuring out what she meant. Something analogous happens with arguments. For instance, take a look at this one. It seems to portray a perfectly okay inference. Socrates is human, therefore he is mortal. However, if we use one of the techniques for evaluating arguments that we'll learn soon, we'll see that it would be classified as invalid, and we'll see what that means later. Clearly, what happens is that the text is somehow incomplete, and that you are expected to supply the missing parts. What is missing is a generalization in line 2, all humans are mortal, which connects the first premise to the conclusion. Socrates is human, all humans are mortal, therefore Socrates is mortal. By the way, an argument in which one or more of its premises, or even its conclusion, is left implicit is called an enthymeme. The gun has the defendant's fingerprints on the trigger. He's clearly guilty. So take a look at this utterance. This seems like an argument, perhaps one given by the prosecutor in court. But notice that in the heat of litigation, there is a bit of information that's been left out, namely, something that explicitly draws out the connection between the premise and the conclusion. The statement in 2 can do the job. If the gun has the defendant's fingerprints on the trigger, then the defendant is guilty. Of course, the prosecutor was right in leaving 2 out, since there is a bit of background information that everyone in the audience is expected to know. Okay, this is all I will say today about standard form. In the next video, we'll see a set of strategies for presenting premises. Okay.